Hi guys, this is chapter 4, key issue 2. We're going to talk a little bit more about culture. Mostly we're focusing on popular culture for today's lesson. And I keep asking my dogs to be quiet, but they don't seem to want to oblige us, so I'll try to talk loud. Okay, so we're looking at some different aspects of culture than we looked at when we were doing folk versus popular culture. So that's still a theme that we're going to carry out throughout chapter 4. But now we're going to look at housing really quick. The differences between, hold on, stop it, Teddy. He's being naughty. The differences between folk housing and popular housing. Folk housing wasn't really decorative, right? It was mostly just to do exactly what it's supposed to do, which is provide some sort of shelter. It can be built basically with whatever is around for that culture to use. So they don't use like special materials. They just use what they have. So there's things that are near them. And a lot of times they will be set up in a way to interact with other people within that group. Okay, so instead of like popular housing is often focused on the family unit that is going to live in that house, but folk culture tends to focus more on the community as a whole rather than the individual families. Popular housing is usually built by professionals, people who build houses for a living. It could very well be that your house is made with materials that are not locally produced, and they probably have been shipped from somewhere else. In popular culture housing, whereas folk housing, it might depend on where it's located as to the style. Popular housing, it's more about when it was built as to what the different styles could be. So these are some examples of folk housing, and I think some of these are in your textbook, but these are all different styles in, let me get my pointer. These are all different housing styles in China, but look how different they are, right? So all of these styles have been built with that culture in mind, right? The culture for this one decided that having an outdoor area was really important, right? This is probably in a richer part of China, we can tell, but this architecture definitely means something to that culture, okay? This is more popular housing. So a lot of these are things you would see in the U.S., but we can see from time to time the housing styles tend to change, okay? We have mostly 19th century stuff here, but like these are really, really popular. You see these all over the place, ranch style housing. I grew up in a ranch style house. My house now is a bungalow, which isn't on here. But especially on the East Coast, you might see some more like neoclassical, neocolonial type housing and things like that. These are really popular in the U.S. Okay? All right. We've also talked about Levittown and that the 1950s housing boom that happened and that transition from urban areas to suburban areas, partially because of the baby boom. Okay, so Levittowns are like cookie cutter houses, remember? So like there's lots of similar houses from place to place in the US because that kind of became a trend. Like we're going to mass produce houses. We're going to pick 3 different floor plans, and every house in the neighborhood is going to be one of those floor plans. It's easy to build a lot of houses that way, right? But then your house, whether it's popular culture or folk culture, can also have a lot to do with your cultural preferences, right? Islamic households tend to have a specific wall that will face Mecca. So they face that wall when they pray 5 times a day to Mecca. We'll talk a little bit more about why they do that in chapter 6. Chinese homes, like many of these ones back here, are often designed on the inside based on feng shui, which has to do with placing objects in areas in order to balance your life. Okay? Which was also kind of popular in the 90s in the US, but it came from China. Sometimes, especially, this is in the South, but then definitely in New England, in the U.S., we see lots of traditional architecture. We don't see a lot of these style houses in Nevada and California. This is from the Garden District in New Orleans. So this house, they have lots of bright colored houses in New Orleans, like lots of yellows and pinks and things like that. And that's because a lot of the residents in New Orleans came from the Caribbean initially. So they wanted to kind of embrace that kind of like tropical culture by painting their houses those colors. You can't see it probably, but all of these on this fence right here, the little spokes on these fences, are actually ears of corn. So it shows like that importance of agriculture in the South, right? This is another example. You see a lot of these in the Garden District in New Orleans. Fun fact, this house right here on the left is the house that Peyton Manning and Eli Manning grew up in. That's the Manning house. And then this house is actually the house that the Haunted Mansion in Disneyland was modeled after. So, pretty cool. Fun facts. Okay, this shows you just different materials that are typically used in different parts of the world. Okay, we use a lot of wood in our houses. You can see that's pretty popular around the world. Sometimes it's brick. But a lot of that has to do with what you've got, right? Also, this just shows you that many of the housing styles originated on the East Coast, and have spread kind of westward and to the south. So most of the housing styles that we see in the U.S. did not originate in the West, right? Like our housing styles mostly came from the New England area. Okay, so when we talk about clothing, there's a difference also between folk clothing and popular clothing. So folk clothing often has to do with your environment. If it's a cold environment, you're going to wear warmer clothing. If you live in a warm climate, you are going to wear less clothing, most likely. It could also be influenced by your occupation, okay? And it can be an expression of cultural pride as well. It's not always just pure practicality. Popular clothing can have something to do with your climate and with your occupation, but it's also very much influenced by fashion trends, right? It's why most people in the U.S. dress sort of similarly. And then, just like with housing, popular housing, clothing trends tend to change based on time period, not location, right? Like people in the 70s wore bell-bottom jeans. It wasn't like people only on the West Coast wore those. Everybody kind of wore those. And then we move on to the 80s, and everyone's wearing acid wash jeans instead of bell-bottom jeans, okay? Not because of where they live, just because bell-bottoms fell out of fashion, okay? Okay, and then we'll talk more, since you guys read an article about this, we're going to talk more about this in class, but gender has a lot to do with clothing styles as well, okay? So in Muslim cultures, it is popular to wear some sort of head covering for women, and the point of this, if you didn't gather this from the article, is to present some modesty, okay, for women. There's lots of different levels of covering, and this just shows you like how popular that style of head covering is in each of those Middle Eastern countries, okay? So the most covered are the burqas seen here. Those are most popular in Saudi Arabia. They tend to be a very conservative, traditional Islamic culture, whereas these countries are a little bit more progressive, right? So we have hijabs that are probably the most popular that you see. So yes, these countries have been a little bit more progressive. They're more likely to have democratic governments and things like that. And of course, not all Muslim women wear any type of covering. It kind of depends on which country you're living in and things like that. Okay, this is just another example. These are Ugandan women who are wearing the gomesi, which is that style of dress. Okay, this would be a good example of, this has no practicality. It's just a symbol of cultural pride, right? My back is really itchy, sorry. My doggies are crazy. The food, we have folk food and popular food. They're not killing each other, I promise. They're just chasing each other. Okay. So folk food has to do with your physical environment. Whatever you have around, much like housing materials, is typically what you are going to eat. For example, in Asia, if you live in a really wet, mild climate, you are likely to grow rice. If you live in a dry, cold climate, you are probably going to grow wheat, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to chapter 10, which is our agricultural unit. And then popular food, it doesn't have to be what grows in your local area. There's lots of shipping, especially in the U.S., from different places where we get food, especially in Nevada. It's hard to grow a lot here, so a lot of the fruits and vegetables that we have are imported from other places. There could be different fads. Hold on. And trends that change from time to time. Such as snack foods and alcohol. I remember when I was a kid, nobody ate sushi. It was like a really weird thing for someone to go out and eat sushi, and now it's the popular thing. Just kind of interesting that things like that change over time. Okay, so this is the amount of beer consumed annually in gallons per capita. So, what are the really popular areas that we drink alcohol? Well, look it. One of them is Nevada. So think about why that is, right? We have a culture that's based on tourism, and gambling is a big part of our economic industries. So it makes sense that we serve a lot of beer. Look at the places that don't consume a lot of alcohol. Large religious states, right? More conservative, don't consume as much alcohol. Okay, although New York seems wrong to me. Probably because New York City itself might be darker, but like more of a red, but I guess greater New York doesn't drink a lot of alcohol. And this is just another example. This is the amount of swine these countries have, pigs. China, lots and lots and lots of pork, which makes sense. They have a lot of pork in their diets, right? The U.S., we also eat a lot of pork. Canada, North America eats a lot of pork. Europe eats a lot of pork. Lots of pork in their diets because they have a lot of pigs. And then you even have food delicacies and food taboos that would be examples of folk culture, probably, more than popular culture. This is an example from Japan. They eat blowfish sometimes in Japan. It's very, very expensive, so it's definitely a delicacy. And the reason it's so expensive is because you have to carve a blowfish a certain way. And if you don't carve it correctly and serve it to somebody correctly, it can be toxic and it can kill you. So it's like a very daring thing to eat, which makes me wonder if it actually tastes any good or if people just like to be crazy and eat crazy things. In India, because they are Hindu, many Indians are vegetarian, or at the very least, they don't eat beef because the cow is considered a sacred animal. So, your culture can really shape different food delicacies and taboos. Okay, so this is not in your book very much, so you really want to take notes on this part. It'll be quick. It's pretty simple concepts. You guys have probably somewhat learned this before, but we need to talk about why European culture is so widespread in the world. And it's really two periods in time that we want to look at. So one is just colonialism. Sometimes we call this the Age of Discovery, between 1400 and 1600. It's when countries like England and France and Spain and Portugal went overseas, discovered new lands, and claimed those lands as their own. Okay? So why did they do that? Because if you had a lot of land holdings, you can make a lot of money. Because once you claim land for your own, you get all of the things in that land, all of those natural resources, especially if there's things like gold or diamonds or really expensive things like that. You get all of those things, and the other thing that you get is you get all the people who are already living in those lands, right? Those indigenous peoples. And they were often used for labor. The Spanish especially did this the Spanish and the Portuguese especially do this in South America, where they're growing sugarcane. And then, of course, a little bit later on, the English and settlers will start to enslave and bring slaves over from Africa to pick wheat and corn and also sugarcane and eventually cotton. Okay. And then also, lots of Europeans were Christian, and especially the Spanish were Catholic, and a big part of Catholicism was missionary work. And so when these new indigenous people were met, they were thought to be savages a lot of the time and less civilized than the Europeans, simply because they were different. And so they used religion to convert these people because it was believed that that could kind of help save them. So that was also a big reason why this happened. Something that's really important that comes out of this period is what's known as the Columbian Exchange. So basically, it's hard to imagine now, but I'm just going to go back for a second here. Before exploration, Europeans knew of Europe. They knew of China. They knew of Africa, but didn't quite understand how far south Africa went. But they had no idea that the Americas were there. So once they found the Americas, they also discovered that the Americas have all of these resources that Europeans had never seen before. Especially important, the potato, right? They discovered potatoes and brought those back over to Europe, and corn and turkey and pumpkin. There would not be, well, I guess they don't really celebrate Thanksgiving in Europe, but they wouldn't have those delicious Thanksgiving foods if they didn't discover them in the Americas. And then we also got things from Europe in the Americas, right? Coffee, which eventually will grow in abundance in South America and Central America. Livestock, like cattle and sheep and pigs and horses, were not in the Americas until the Europeans brought them. However, that all sounds really lovely, but the other thing that gets swapped back and forth is disease. So the big one that comes from Europe to the Americas is smallpox. And when smallpox hits in the Americas, it kills the majority of indigenous peoples. It wipes out a huge portion of their population. And part of the reason this happens is because Europeans had had smallpox for centuries. So a lot of Europeans had some immunities to them. That isn't to say that people in Europe didn't die of smallpox. They did. But the native populations, the indigenous people, had no immunities whatsoever to smallpox. So it just really did a number on them. Also things like influenza, typhus, just all of these really terrible diseases that can be really, really deadly. And a lot of indigenous peoples died because of this. Okay, so that's the Columbian Exchange. I would definitely take notes on that one. And then, of course, assimilation was often expected of these indigenous populations, meaning they were expected to completely give up. Hey, they were expected to completely give up their here, come here, Titty. Their cultures and adopt the European culture. So this is a picture from an assimilation school in the West. These are Native Americans. They were forced to cut their hair and adopt European haircuts, which was a huge tragedy for them because their long hair was very symbolic and very meaningful to them. These are the Mestizo in Mexico and in South America. They are a mixture of indigenous blood and European. So there was intermarriage and inter-reproduction happening there. And those people were kind of expected to also adopt the European style since they were partially European. Okay, the other period is the scramble for Africa. So that happens in the late 19th century up into World War I. And it's basically the same thing, except this time it's in Africa, and then also I'm going to show you in a second in Asia. So basically what happens is, for the same reasons, Europe decides that they want to have more land holdings because it means more resources, it means more money, and more power. And primarily what they really need these resources for now at this point is that Europe had just industrialized, so now they needed all these materials to keep their factories going. So you can see from this map, almost every single location in Africa was owned by a European country, okay? So North Africa largely belonged to the French. Okay, the British had a lot of land in North Africa. Okay, so almost everywhere you see here was colonized by somebody in Europe, by some country in Europe. And the same thing happened in Southeast Asia. So most of us know at this point that India was once part of Britain. So these are all the British land holdings in purple. Even the U.S. got into it. So the Philippines was once a U.S. colony as well. Okay, so why this is really important for this unit is because there is a reason that so many people in North Africa speak French, right? There is a reason why there's so much British culture in India and so much Indian culture actually in England. There is a reason that the most widely spoken language in the world is English, okay? It's because the British colonized lots of different areas. Okay, so what's really important about colonialism, the Columbian Exchange, imperialism, is that the reason Western culture is so prominent in the world is really because of these two periods. Okay, so that is it for this little lesson. The next one will be shorter. I had to add in all this stuff on this one on colonialism and imperialism because you really don't get a good explanation for it in your book. All right, so be ready for a pop quiz, and I will see you next time.